welcome on board the Rich Planet Starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall. 2 weeks ago, I screened an interview with aeronautical engineer Roy Dutton, where he described his astronautical theory of strange aerial craft. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Roy spent time investigating crop circles. It must be said that from the early 1990s onwards, the number of man-made or planked crop circles greatly increased, which successfully muddied the waters and drew attention from the original crop circle mystery, which researchers like Roy have looked into. The reason for the muddying of the waters is explained in my film, Crop Circles: The Hidden Truth. In tonight's interview, Roy talks about his analysis of crop circles and other areas which have fascinated him over the years. Because I know that you're very much a cause and effect man. So if there's an effect, there has to be a cause behind it. So, and you visited many of these crop circle sites and scratched your head and thought about it, and you thought, well, what could be causing this? I mean, I was particularly interested in the way that you analysed the lay of the crop. Could you tell us about that, Roy?
Well, yes. It was a mystery, and I was taken into my first crop circle by Dusty Taylor. I was absolutely flabbergasted because it was flattened straight right to the ground and swirled. It was a big one with a ring round it, 2 rings, I think, actually, Saturn-like rings. And I said to him, Dusty, which was this a is this a circular formation? He said, no, it's a bit elliptical. And he told me. I said, well, which is the long axis? Mm-hmm. And he said, he pointed to an axis which was lying in the lay of the field, the slope of the field. And I thought, that suggests to me it was a circular formation of some kind that was projected onto a sloping field and therefore became elliptical.
Right, right. So it's like, so in other words, it's like a perfect circle cutting through something on an inclined plane,
yes,
right? Okay, yeah. which would result in an ellipse. Yeah. So you gathered from that then that it was something directly above that. That's what you then thought.
That's right. I got the impression it might be a column of some sort,
right,
that had been projected down onto the field,
okay,
from above. And then I started to analyse the lays of the plants, the spiraled lays. And Busty Taylor and Colin Andrews provided me with data, photographs and drawings of drawings from Colin Andrews, measured drawings showing how the plant was swirled, and also from Busty Taylor some very good overhead shots, near the overhead shots of small grape shot circles. And they're called grape shot, of course, because they tend to be scattered around some of the bigger bigger formations. And I then began to look to see what pattern, what mathematical relationship could be applied to these things, which might explain how they're produced.
Because when you looked at that pattern, you saw that it was made up of a series of discrete actual sweeps, if you like. Is that right?
That's right. That's the first clue. They were generally stripped. They were strips of spiral. They were spiral strips.
Spiral strips. So a sequence of spiral strips throughout a 360 degree. And can you because I know that you made a model, and we'll take a look at that, which actually demonstrates what the theory that you came up with, that it was a line scanner. Can you tell us what the line scanner is?
Yes. First of all, I had to satisfy myself that what was producing these spirals was not a plank, or a roll or anything like that.
Yeah.
That these plants were genuinely bent without breakage
Okay.
and beautifully inscribed into the crop.
Okay.
And so, having sort of satisfied myself that this was the case, then I began to ask myself, well, how could this happen? And I did an analysis of, one can split up the analysis of a swirl pattern, we can analyse a swirl pattern by looking to see what the relative vector is outwards and transversely, rotationally.
Yeah.
So by looking at the combination of these vectors, it then became clear to me of what kind of organisation there was in producing these things. And what came out was that, to put it very simply, it looked as if they'd been formed by something going outwards from the centre of the formation at a steady speed, while something else was going round,
rotating at a fixed rate,
at an increasing rate as you went further out, like on a roundabout. You see? Now, putting those two vectors together, those two systems together, I could actually reproduce those things accurately, those swirls. I produced this model to demonstrate to audiences the principles involved. This little arm here, with the brush on the end, in fact is free only to move radially outwards. And it flips back to the middle and then begins to move radially outwards again in a straight line. But as this is happening, the whole assembly is rotating steadily in one direction or the other. It could be clockwise or anti-clockwise. So that the path travelled by the brush is a spiral path, a curled path. Now I'm going to try to demonstrate how the circle is produced in this way. Notice that the gaps are being filled in on each successive rotation until the entire circle is created. The actual shape of the spiral depends on the relative rate of outward sweep and rotation. This is a very short spiral, but sometimes they can go all the way around.
You thought it was moving at fixed velocity from the centre to the edge at this at a fixed rotational speed,
and then flipping back again.
And then once it got to the edge, it instantaneously would go to the centre and then start a second
swirl. A whole series of strips, all round, and then going round again very rapidly to fill in the gaps.
Right. Okay. And you actually modelled that on a computer, didn't you?
I modelled that on a computer, and I also tried to demonstrate it with that little model of mine.
You could then work out the ratio between the fixed outward velocity and the angular velocity. Was there any correlation between that ratio?
It didn't matter what the actual speeds were, it could produce any kind of spiral with that form. Because believe me, you can get spirals of other forms, and I did try this with other equations. Colin Andrews sent these drawings to me, probably because he felt they would defy all my efforts to explain them in simple terms. After about 2 months of frustration with this problem, the answer came to me very, very quickly. The different bands of alternating swirl directions were merely indicated that the projector beam had been operated in several different modes to produce annular rings. In fact, soon after receiving these diagrams, I was able to modify my program to incorporate that feature very successfully. The big problem was presented by that unevenly segmented annulus. Well, suddenly the penny dropped, as they say. The flattening had begun at position 1 with the progressive clockwise flattening. This had continued until a 72-degree segment had been covered. At that point in the proceedings, the beam had then flipped backwards through 144 degrees to commence clockwise flattening in the direction as before. However, while the clockwise flattening had been occurring, the virtual center of the disturbance had moved from 1 to 2. The annulus had been steadily precessing anti-clockwise, following this small circle shown here. So when the flip back to position 2 had occurred, the center was then at position 2 here on the precession path. In all, this process had occurred 5 times to form the segmented circle or annulus that we see here. Now that little precession path circle had a diameter of 8 feet, which shows how large this formation really was. For me, this was undeniable proof that an advanced piece of scanning technology was being employed to produce those wonderful patterns.
This is suggestive then that whatever technology is being used is being generated from at some certain height above the crop circle. And were you able to do any analysis to determine how high?
No, because all I could say was that whatever it was that generated these things, it would have to be at a sufficient altitude so that to allow the beam to come down vertically,
okay.
From the sky.
Okay.
So that otherwise crops would be splayed at the edges. It wouldn't be pushing the crop out at the edges.
Okay. So you think it's the height is probably significant. Either the height is significant, or it could be done by a craft which is, let's say, 1,000 feet wide and at a very low altitude, couldn't it?
Yes, possibly. Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, actually, they might even be produced from orbit, for all I know, from space. But it's not likely, I don't think. I think because of the focusing problem. The only thing that could create the flattening of the crops, which didn't damage it, and produce the heating sufficiently in the stems to cause the distortion of the stem cells. This was obviously energy which you had a mechanical property, not just an electromagnetic one.
Right.
It wasn't just microwave energy, it was something which also could push the crop in the direction of the beam motion.
Let's just say then, if we have a craft which has got a huge, great big, just a long metal rod, 2 feet wide, on a pivot, and a machine that works in exactly the same way that your machine works on a much larger scale, right? It could, and if it was high enough up in the sky, it would produce that crop circle in exactly the same manner. The only difference being, it's not a physical metal rod which has been used to flatten the crop. Because there was another case where there was no crop circle produced, but farmer witnessed 2 feet wide black tubes.
Yes, Mr. Bull. We were staying at that farm, in fact, and he told us about this event that occurred the year before.
It was overcast, no sunshine, sort of a dull-ish sort of day. It's this field here. It was in winter barley at the time. It's a cornfield most of the time. And looking across diagonally, looking at the wood behind, it was to the left, about halfway along the wood line that you can probably see on the film. The first one, where I stood in the field nearby, and then when that died away, the second one appeared near the tree, near the woods in the far distance. And suddenly, in front of me was a tube running up about 1,000 feet. Oh, well, I'm not a good judge, but I would say 1,000 feet plus, or coming down out of sight onto the ground. This was not very many yards away from me, but the important point about it that struck me with it was the circular motion of the ashes in the grit on the ground. It didn't appear to be being sucked up the tube. It was just rotating at a high speed on the ground, about 2 feet wide, 2 feet 6 perhaps on the ground. And the tube was vertical and perpendicular, and it didn't grow at the top or anything. And that was unusual. That was one of the unusual things about it. And this went on for several minutes, and then this died away, and then another one appeared about 200 yards from me then, in the other corner of the field. And this was a similar situation, again, lasting about the same time. I've worked these fields for 50 years, and I've never seen anything like it before, nothing at all like it.
How long did the tubes last?
Well, several minutes, several minutes, probably 3 minutes. It's difficult to tell when you're there and watch the sunny, but it was definitely there for some time. You could stand and watch it. This is a diary of 1990, the year that we saw those tubes we were describing in the field, and just to show you that the entry was made at the time as shown here.
Now, I asked him whether the blackness of the tube was caused by this stuff being sucked up. He said, no, I thought that at first, but it wasn't. It was just lying there. It wasn't caused by the... and also, he could see through the bottom of it, which indicates a kind of polarisation effect, possibly. And it occurred to me that he could have witnessed the kind of beam that I'm talking about. That this was the kind of energy that might be used for crop formation. But he was watching it, he was looking at it with the beam unfocused. The beam was parallel, it was a parallel sided beam, and he had just seen it in scan mode in effect. But perhaps if it had been focused at the bottom like that, it might have actually pushed the crop down, you see, the same kind of energy. And then I went on to conceive that if it could do that, and it was then made divergent at the bottom, that it could lift things up.
Why not join me, Richard D. Hall, live for an evening on board the Starship at the Oaken Gates Theatre in Telford, 11th of May 2011. In the show, I'll be addressing many of the areas I've covered over the past year, including false flag terrorism, UFOs, animal mutilation, the financial crisis, and more. Learn what your government isn't telling you and what your media isn't allowed to tell you. Tickets are available now from the Oaken Gates Theatre website. Further future venues include Weston-super-Mare, Leeds, Barnsley and Newcastle upon Tyne, with further venues to be arranged. Find more details on the richplanet.net website.